Session 1. Joining with Pope Francis. Roots and Challenge. Ignatian Spirituality and the Legacy of Pedro Arrupe. The Professor of Moral Theology at Fordham University, Tomás Massaro, with us here.
Thank you very much. You are the honor. I am. I'd like to thank everybody here in the whole city of Miami for the warm reception I have received. I've been very impressed just in a few hours with the great work of the Instituto Jesuita Pedro Arrupe. I'm honored to be invited to contribute my little grain of sand to our understanding of this important topic. And I promise that I will try to speak in English a little bit slower than Sixto Garcia spoke this morning in Spanish, or maybe Cubano or something. He was good. He was just fast. Okay. So when I first attempted to learn a little bit of Spanish in my late 20s, and by the way, that was basically a failed experiment. I've had a few masses in Spanish, but I've never been invited back a second time by any of those groups. At that time, I was approaching my priestly ordination, and I did want to celebrate Mass in Spanish on occasion. And one of the first words that my instructor taught me, not surprisingly, is the word calvo. I was already prematurely bald even before my ordination, and luckily I've always had a good sense of humor about the whole thing, and that's good-natured kidding is fine, in any language, actually. Now, the image of my talk is the image of braiding, forming braids, so it may be surprising for someone as bald as me to introduce that image, but I do want to use the image of braiding to situate the central points of my address. I can readily appreciate, I think we all can, the great skill that some people have in taking several strands of individual hairs or other materials, fibrous materials like rope or even steel, and braiding them together to produce beautiful and useful items like rope, industrial materials like steel. It's a great accomplishment of utility and of creativity. Each strand of a braid benefits from the relationship of proximity to its partners and its neighbors. It's more than the sum of its parts, a beautiful and useful braid. The metaphor of braiding fits perfectly with my topic today, and let me explain. The theological strands, the theological hairs that I wish to combine into hopefully a beautiful braid are 4 in number. First, I will choose select elements of Ignatian spirituality as it comes to us from, we all know, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Secondly, the legacy of the Second Vatican Council, a truly pastoral, ecumenical church council. Third, the person of, he's not there anymore, of Pedro Arrupe, the outstanding Superior General of the Society of Jesus. Fourth, the papacy of Pope Francis, especially his immensely important efforts at the renewal of the church, a church re-energized for evangelization in ways that are effective, culturally sensitive, and oriented to the promotion of social justice. Now, of course, there are other additional strands of great importance in understanding the agenda and the approach of Pope Francis. Astute authors have already compiled entire libraries of books and articles documenting the profound theological, cultural, and historical roots of his papal leadership. One thinks immediately of the distinctive thought and culture of the Latin American Church, and specifically his heritage as a person of Argentina, influenced by the Teología del Pueblo and the larger continent-wide movement of liberation theology. Fortunately, later speakers at this international conference will bring their immense expertise to bear to benefit all of us by explaining the Latin American Church and Vatican II and its reception, etc. The two most promising addresses will follow mine immediately this afternoon, so you don't need to wait very long for that material. I will limit my braiding exercise to the weaving together of just those four strands that I just mentioned. So once again, they are 1, Ignatian spirituality, 2, Vatican II, 3, Pedro Arrupe, and 4, Pope Francis himself. The central point I'll be making in all of these, as I go through all four of these realities, is that the four cohere in remarkable ways. They produce a splendid vision of a church and discipleship that we so desperately need in our new millennium. Catholics today are truly fortunate to drink from the deep wells of life-giving water provided to us by Ignatius, by the Second Vatican Council, by the servant of God, Pedro Arrupe, and now by Pope Francis himself for the last 6 years. First, let's highlight those elements of Ignatian spirituality that are relevant to our understanding of Pope Francis and his priorities for the renewal of our church today. The first and perhaps most obvious ethical practice associated with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius involves the discernment of spirits. This aspect of Jesuit spirituality has certainly left a mark on Pope Francis. Even though, I always point this out to audiences, Pope Francis, or Bergoglio, has not lived in a Jesuit community or participated in ordinary Jesuit life or any of our apostolates since he became a bishop in the year 1992. The values of responsible discernment is so ingrained in all of us Jesuits, everything we do, personally and collectively, that he still exhibits these qualities after a gap of 20-some years. It's more than a matter of merely wise decision-making to practice discernment. It practices prudence, a prudence that all of us prize in temporal affairs. True Ignatian discernment always includes ample reference to God, our Creator, as the primary author of all that exists, pointing always to the one who draws us forward in mission. Key part of Ignatian discernment, it's theocentric. When we are tempted to settle for what is comfortable or convenient, the Ignatian spiritual theme of the magis impels us forward to do more, to sacrifice further, to give without counting the cost, to quote the words of the prayer of generosity that's so popular in Ignatian circles. Mystic that he was, St. Ignatius strove to respond without hesitation to the promptings of the Holy Spirit, and he did his utmost to instruct his companions about what constitutes a truly authentic decision, or as he calls it, an election. The proper course of action is the one that cooperates most fully with God's grace, the one that advances the divine will for the world. Whatever helps souls, to cite a recurring phrase in the spiritual exercises and the constitutions that Ignatius himself authored. There's no room here for selfish concerns, not even the subtle variety of self-centeredness captured by the word self-righteousness, when you are utterly persuaded that you and only you know exactly what is right for someone else. Both Ignatius and Pope Francis display an extreme aversion to forcing anything down the throats of a person who might be wavering between alternative courses of action. In typical and recurring displays of great pastoral sensitivity, each of these masters of discerning love takes account of human weakness, even if it does open them up to charges of laxity, as they attempt to respect the Christian freedom of their fellow travelers. As Francis insists, pastors seek to form consciences, not to replace or to compel consciences. Likewise, St. Ignatius encouraged open dialogue and scholarly disputations, even with Protestants, in the age of Luther and Calvin. Francis is also a proponent of dialogue, even when it raises some eyebrows. Many objected to his initiative in drafting and signing the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. You'll recall that joint statement that he signed with Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayeb, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, on the 4th of February earlier this year when he was visiting Abu Dhabi. As another example, the most prominent criticisms of Amoris Laetitia, the apostolic exhortation that Pope Francis published on the topic of love in the family, the criticisms centered on pastoral wisdom that Francis shared in the 8th chapter of the document. That chapter bears the title, Accompanying, Discerning, and Integrating Weakness. And that chapter addresses the needs of families attempting to grapple with crises of commitment, utter breakdown, and resulting deep pastoral need. To his credit, Francis even here refuses to despair of the emblematic Jesuit quest for finding God in all things, even amidst the shattering of a family unit. With the heart of a pastor, Francis is eager to apply the medicine of mercy wherever possible, just as Ignatius so often included explicit advice for special needs or extenuating circumstances in his spiritual writings, and even in his guidance for the internal governance of the young Society of Jesus. Two men, centuries apart, share a similar commitment to testing the spirits and making decisions on behalf of God's ways, not our own ways, not our own preoccupations, our own desires. While neither man is immune from occasional missteps, each aims to implement discerning love in ways that respect every creature of God Almighty. We could treat many further points of similarity between Ignatius and Francis, and more broadly, between the tradition of Ignatian spirituality and apostolic visions of the current Pope. The remaining insights that I am most eager to share involves the congruence between the Ignatian theme of spiritual health and freedom on one hand, and the concern for the material well-being of all people on the other hand. Not many scholars of Jesuit sources highlight the great concern of Ignatius for the materially poor. So popular perceptions sometimes err in imagining the founder of the Society of Jesus as somehow socially disengaged or even otherworldly in his orientation, someone for whom this earth is perhaps merely a waiting room for the afterlife, thus diminishing the urgency of feeding the hungry and providing a secure existence for all. This is not the Ignatius I know. And I venture to say that Pope Francis would not recognize a socially indifferent Ignatius either. Ignatian spirituality lends itself precisely to inner worldly involvements that echo the call of Jesus in Matthew 25 to care for the concrete physical needs of all of our hard-pressed neighbors. To downplay these concerns is to overlook how Ignatius approached people holistically, as amalgams of both body and soul, and how often Ignatius spoke of sharing all we have, both our spiritual gifts and the material resources that God intended to support all people. Perhaps the best witness to these concerns of Ignatius, even more eloquent than his actual words preserved in old documents now, is the record of Jesuit efforts at addressing poverty and lifting up the marginalized over the past 480 years. It's no escapist spirituality that inspired Alberto Hurtado, one of the most recently canonized Jesuit saints, to start the Hogar de Cristo movement to serve the desperate and the homeless in his native Chile. We could easily cite many examples of Jesuits and their apostolates in countries around the world to amplify this point about the continuous concern for social justice on the part of those inspired by Ignatian spirituality, desiring to make a physical, material difference in people's lives. Two examples that come to my mind immediately are Father Horace McKenna, working so hard for so long to meet the dire needs of the poor in this nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Or the example of Father Rutilio Grande in El Salvador, assisting the forgotten in farming villages such as Aguilares and El Paisnal, encouraging in a bold apostolate what would lead eventually to martyrdom, as it eventually did also for his close friend, Oscar Romero, who's a saint. For every Jesuit conducting research in libraries, that's where I spent most of my time, or offering spiritual direction in retreat houses, like this beautiful one here at Manresa, there is another Jesuit out there on the front lines, working in the fight against poverty. Ignatian spirituality inspires the full range of acts of service to the Church and to the world. All these efforts are important, and all are Ignatian in inspiration and in substance. The Ignatian vision is intent on discerning God's presence in all of reality, and it does not avert its eyes from poverty, suffering, and injustice. Rather, it supports the two types of efforts to assist the poor. First, the direct provision of material assistance in acts of charity, and second, those indirect efforts of social justice advocacy that seek to change the political and economic structures and thus to ameliorate the social conditions that harm so many of God's children. Ignatius may have departed the scene before we ever spoke much of structural change, social justice, or the Church of the Poor, but his spiritual progeny, including Pope Francis and all Jesuits, have embraced the noble enterprise of lifting up the poor who are especially beloved to Jesus. And the more you know about Ignatius, the more you will appreciate the social dimensions of his spiritual and ecclesial vision. When we consider below the contributions of Pedro Arrupe, often considered to be the second founder of the Society of Jesus, he even looks a little bit like St. Ignatius, it is easy to perceive in him the full flowering for our times of those aspects of the Ignatian vision. More about that shortly. But we consider Arrupe we cannot consider Arrupe without first taking up the second of our four topics that we're braiding together, Vatican II. It was the Church Council that provided the context and opportunity for Pedro Arrupe to lead his Jesuit brothers forward along the path of social justice ministry. The changes wrought by Vatican II favored a more activist spirituality, and it opened a door through which Arrupe would lead the Society of Jesus to promote social transformation in our time. As my friend and longtime colleague, the Jesuit church historian John O'Malley, as he's fond of saying, Vatican II is significant for its style as much as for the substance of the groundbreaking documents that it produced. Its eagerness to embrace the best of human culture rather than to condemn, its tendency to laud secular progress rather than to cast a suspicious eye on human rights and freedoms, its openness to the rightful autonomy of secular spheres of life, all these qualities and more allowed the Catholic Church to rise from the defensive crouch that it had assumed since at least the time of the French Revolution. The implication for the social mission of the Church was profound indeed. Freed now to embrace its status as truly a world church, not just a European creation, it could at last disavow colonialism and its many destructive legacies in warped political and economic systems that privileged a small elite and oppressed the majority poor populations of the global South. The breakthrough document within my own field of expertise, which is Catholic social teaching, was, of course, Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, which was overwhelmingly approved by a vote of the Council Fathers at the very end of the Council's final session, December of 1965. Even the document's title signals a commitment to embrace all that is good about the modern world, rather to disengage from it or even to retreat from it. The opening lines of that document issue a clarion call for social justice, as the Church identifies herself closely, in an unprecedented way, with the poor and the marginalized of our struggling world. Much in sync with Ignatian spirituality, this pastoral constitution commits the Church to renewed efforts to listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit, including the aspirations of the poor and oppressed for a better life. Specifically mentioned in paragraph 9 of that document, by the way, are the hopes of women, of workers, and of ethnic minorities who aspire to advance in society. Later parts of that stirring document chart the way forward for a church dedicated to cultural sensitivity, social dialogue, peacemaking, and the full range of constructive social engagements. No more ghetto Catholicism, no more disembodied, aloof, world-rejecting spirituality. Not for our church. Especially impressive is how Gaudium et Spes fits hand in glove with previous Vatican II documents that reformed the Church's practices in liturgy and missionary activity, that revised its self-perception through adopting an updated ecclesiology, Lumen Gentium, that deepened its understanding of the theological sources, such as Scripture and the patristic tradition, and at long last reevaluated its relationship to other religious communities, other churches, other religions, and affirmed its appreciation of all the world's faithful, no matter their specific doctrines. Later in this conference, we'll be hearing much about the reception of the Second Vatican Council, especially in Latin America, including the contribution of successive conferences of CELAM, especially the ones at Medellin, Puebla, and Aparecida. Along with the development of liberation theology, the achievements of these continent-wide Episcopal conferences indicate that Latin America has surely by now become what we call a source church, leading global Catholicism in increasingly prominent ways in recent decades. For now, we transition to the third strand of this account, so I'm halfway through my talk, by the way, the contribution of Pedro Arrupe himself, that Basque Jesuit who served as Superior General from 1965 to 1983. Arrupe attended both the final sessions of Vatican II and the Medellin Conference in Colombia, drawing inspiration from each great gathering of church leaders as he set the course for the Jesuit order that he was entrusted to lead. His active participation in both those assemblies amplified the global vision that he had already acquired. Although he was born in Spain and educated in Europe and North America, Arrupe had served for decades as a missionary in Japan, where Christians are a tiny, often persecuted minority. There, Arrupe himself had endured imprisonment as a suspected spy, including many weeks in solitary confinement during World War II. And as you know, he even survived the atomic blast at Hiroshima while overseeing the Jesuit novitiate in the suburbs of that city when it was brutally struck by atomic weapons on August 6, 1945. Everything about the biography of Arrupe testifies to the remarkable boldness of vision, grounded on a mystical closeness to God, which he maintained even through the debilitating stroke that he suffered in 1981, and right up to his death in 1991. These are the qualities supporting his cause for canonization, which was formally introduced in Rome on February 5th of this year. We could spend hours recounting the great spiritual and apostolic achievements of Pedro Arrupe. In order to illustrate his contributions to social justice ministry, grounded so thoroughly in Ignatian spirituality, I will cite just a few of his many initiatives. To start with a modest one, internal to Jesuit governance, Father Arrupe helped establish an annual collection to provide resources for pressing needs that Jesuits around the world encounter in their work. During the season of Lent every year, every Jesuit is asked to make a free will contribution to FACSI, F-A-C-S-I. The acronym in Latin signals the Charitable and Apostolic Fund administered by Father General himself. So these days it's Arturo Sosa. Although the funds raised from a few thousand men, and we all practice avowed poverty, so we don't have a lot to give, it's quite limited. in the amount. But the collection and the distribution of this money gives each of us Jesuits a stake in the struggles for justice unfolding within the communities served by our brother Jesuits around the world. The fund is a concrete way of living out the commitments that were articulated in the 32nd General Congregation, GC 32 we call it, a worldwide meeting of Jesuit delegates that met in Rome over several months in the course of 1974 and 5 to deliberate on the core identity and the ministerial engagements of the Society of Jesus. Most such congregations convene primarily upon the death of a superior general. The goal is to elect a new leader. But this momentous one, GC 32, was initiated by Pedro Arrupe when he was still very much alive and intending to serve many more years in office. Because the deliberations and the overall agenda of that meeting reflected his desire to rededicate the Society of Jesus to the justice dimensions of our faith, the event is often called Arrupe's Congregation. The 16 final documents of GC 32, they came out in 1975, constitute a clarion call to orient the works of Jesuits around the world to the service of faith and the promotion of justice. That phrase forms the title of Decree 4, the longest document and the one that describes the Jesuit mission today. The signature motif of social justice is repeatedly recognized in these documents as an integral element and a requirement of the gospel of Jesus Christ, not just for Jesuits, of course, but for all who profess our Savior. When I entered the Jesuit novitiate in 1983, Arrupe was, of course, still alive, but had already resigned for health reasons after his stroke, soon to be succeeded by Peter Hans Kolvenbach. I distinctly recall how all of us novices were issued a whole stack of books that contained the collected essays and important addresses of Pedro Arrupe, and which served as the basis for countless hours of study and discussion, at least in my novitiate in the early 80s. I think it's still going on. Besides being inspired by this man's commitment to social justice, which I've done my best to emulate in my own professional career as a scholar of Catholic social teaching, I was also very impressed by how strategic and downright clever Arrupe instinctively was. He knew well that it is not enough to adopt a formal commitment to principles like the promotion of justice or the option for the poor. That's good, but it's not enough. If you really want to change the world, you must discover and develop realistic and effective means to accomplish your goals, to forge concrete plans, and to provide resources to keep that momentum going. The questions that sparked his imagination were often how questions. He would ask, with diminishing numbers of Jesuits available for ministry these days, how may we accomplish the mission by tapping new energies found throughout the people of God? His habitual shorthand expression for this quest, endearing, though not quite grammatical, at least in English, his expression was, how to do, how to do. Arrupe demonstrated a deep appreciation, to cite just one example now, for the multiplier effect. Do you know that phrase, the multiplier effect? I love that. Even a small pebble, if dropped strategically in the center of a still pond, can produce surprisingly strong ripples that roil the waters all the way to the edges of that pond. In a similar way, Arrupe followed his hunch that we could accomplish much more together if we widened the circle of contributors. It is thus no coincidence that during his years as general, Jesuit provinces and apostolates around the world became much more deliberate about sharing Ignatian spirituality with an ever-expanding group of people, alumni of Jesuit schools, colleagues serving in institutions where Jesuits also serve, side by side, people of all ages who step up to volunteer in pastoral and apostolic programs that amplify the initiatives of many Jesuits in the places that we sponsor. And here in Miami, you know what they are. Belen, Prep, here, this wonderful retreat house, and parishes and other social works. After all, you need not be a vowed member of a religious order to accomplish great things for God's kingdom, and to do so in a distinctive Ignatian rhythm. As a Jesuit, I can think of nothing dearer to my heart than having excellent lay partners in mission. That's the thing that I ask for Christmas every year. Give me some more colleagues who follow Ignatian rhythms. Today, Arrupe's creativity still inspires us. Creativity in investing in the Ignatian formation of our colleagues, opening up numerous new opportunities around the world. We today witness a proliferation of programs that take full advantage of this multiplier effect I've been talking about. From the Jesuit Volunteer Corps to Ignatian programs for young and mid-career professionals, and even to retired associates who pray together and volunteer their skills to accomplish social justice goals. A new model has emerged of Jesuits as animators of apostolates who depend upon the energy and expertise of many of their collaborators. I call this the new model of Jesuits as the straws. We stir the drink. We don't control it. We just keep it animated. An especially creative umbrella organization serving these purposes is the Ignatian Solidarity Network, ISN, which engages in witness, education, and advocacy, especially for social justice, and it includes people of all ages. All these initiatives multiply our partners and increase the reach of Ignatian spirituality in a world so deeply in need of inspiration. While this model of outreach is not entirely new, and of course cannot be attributed to Arrupe alone, I believe that Father Pedro Arrupe is right now looking down from heaven approvingly upon every creative strategy that we develop for extending the Ignatian charism in ways that he encouraged and inspired in his own lifetime. I further believe that he planted many such seeds with his famous address to alumni of Jesuit schools. Remember, it was delivered in Valencia, Spain in the year 1973 on the feast of St. Ignatius, July 31st. There, he challenged his listeners to be men and women for others. And I saw that phrase on the stationery just now, implicitly rededicating all Jesuit schools to the noble task of education for justice. May our partners continue to multiply. May the influence of Ignatian spirituality continue to expand like those ripples on the pond. Beyond the educational sector, Arrupe effected an enormous change with a November 1980 letter that he wrote and promulgated announcing the launch of JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service, with its threefold approach of accompaniment, service, and advocacy. Advocacy for some of the most vulnerable people on earth. In 2018, according to its annual report, JRS served nearly 678,000 displaced persons in 56 nations, including frontline nations, transit countries, and receiving countries like the United States, where the challenge here is with the immigration service, but also in policy, but also with the idea of getting additional resettlement assistance and sponsorship resources for displaced families trying to start a new life in a more peaceful location. I cannot think of any more important work than serving, accompanying, and advocating for this share of the 68 million refugees who seek assistance in the moment of greatest vulnerability for their families, especially in our times today, which are so hateful and xenophobic. Sadly, despite its great efforts, it's very impressive, the work of JRS, it has the capacity to serve almost exactly only 1% of the total global population of displaced persons. Nowadays, JRS is especially dedicated to providing educational resources. So even in those refugee camps scattered throughout the world, people can continue to learn, young people and even older people as well. It provides psychosocial services. The mental health component is extremely important. The needs of traumatized refugees are so deep, and so tragically falling through the cracks so often. The advocacy part of this triangle finds JRS personnel lobbying legislatures around the world for better funded refugee settlement programs and more rational and predictable asylum systems. So as people flee their lives from violence and severe human rights violations, they can find a safe haven somewhere. We hardly need to leave anything behind about Arrupe as we turn to the fourth and final strand to be woven together in our Ignatian braid. That fourth strand is the current papal ministry of Papa Francisco. One unmistakable feature of the discourse of this pope is how frequently he evokes such phrases as, and you know them, the culture of inclusion, the culture of encounter, the culture of accompaniment, the culture of dialogue. Commentators have criticized him for employing kind of a verbal tic or stutter of some sort. But I would contend that the repetition of this phrase, culture of, is more than a tic. It's a veritable echo, a repetition with just slightly different words of many of the themes and values espoused by Pedro Arrupe. Inclusion, encounter, accompaniment, dialogue. We could add many others, mercy, tenderness, etc. They were also affirmed by Vatican II and have been supported by Ignatian spirituality for hundreds of years now. Our Ignatian braid is getting tighter and tighter, is it not? Since Francis burst on the global scene upon his election, observers of all stripes have been trying to figure out exactly what it is that makes him tick, what drives his energies, what accounts for his social and pastoral priorities. As with many riddles, the answer is hidden in plain sight. By his own admission in interviews and writings, nothing influences Francis more profoundly than his Jesuit background and the Ignatian spirituality in which he is steeped. Sure, he appreciates Franciscan spirituality, but his true spiritual DNA is thoroughly Ignatian. How could it be otherwise? To paraphrase the title that Gustavo Gutierrez chose for his book on the distinctive spirituality associated with Latin America and its rich spiritual cultures, Francis drinks from his own well. The Ignatian spirituality that he imbibed as a young Jesuit continues to exert strong influence upon Francis, even as an old man now, as a source and as a resource. Other presenters at this conference will surely spell out in considerable detail the significance of many papal initiatives and decisions of Francis. I have time merely in my closing 2 or 3 minutes now to note a coincidence, which turns out to be no mere coincidence at all when you consider the perduring influence of Ignatian spirituality on this pontiff. On February 19th of this year, Arturo Sosa, the Colombian Jesuit who joins that long line of successors to Arrupe as Superior General, promulgated a letter announcing 4 apostolic preferences of the Society of Jesus for the coming decade. Coming at the culmination of a 16-month process of broad consultation, these preferences, of course, do not displace or exclude other legitimate Jesuit priorities, but they do provide focus for Jesuit efforts worldwide. The 4 are, first, to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and the practice of discernment. 2, to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, in a mission of reconciliation and justice. 3, to accompany young people, jóvenes, in the creation of a hope-filled future. 4th, to collaborate in the care for our common home, the earth. I hardly need mention how closely these Jesuit preferences match the initiatives of Pope Francis himself. He repeatedly emphasizes the first item regarding spiritual renewal and discernment as when he displays his profound pastoral concern for families in crisis in the document Amoris Laetitia. The second item, regarding accompanying victims in our world of injustice, matches very closely the concerns of Francis for refugees and other poor people, a social concern captured well by his insistence that nobody ever be treated as descartables, people worthy of nothing but to be thrown away and discarded. The third item, regarding youth, will bring a knowing smile to the face of anyone who has witnessed the delight that Francis displays when in the company of youth, such as at the World Days of Youth that he's attended, or anyone who has read his beautiful apostolic exhortation, Christus Vivit, that captures so splendidly the spirit of the Synod on Youth, over which Francis so enthusiastically presided just last year. The fourth Jesuit preference, of course, contains the very subtitle of Francis's wonderful ecological encyclical Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home, which has inspired renewed faith-based environmental awareness and activism around the world. It's quite enough to establish that Francis and the Society of Jesus are on the same page. It's of no consequence to speculate on who got to that page first. Interestingly, Father Sosa kindly released the Spanish text of a letter that he received from Pope Francis 2 weeks before the public announcement of those four Jesuit preferences. He thanked Sosa in that letter for graciously sharing the content of the forthcoming announcement a full month before its rollout. So Francis knew in advance what was coming from Jesuit headquarters down the street in Rome, and he approved fully. But that set of facts does not address the question of to what extent the Jesuit leadership borrowed ideas from Francis. Maybe the arrows run both ways. Or perhaps whether the Pope had been borrowing all along from the leadership of the Society of Jesus crosstown. In the end, it's hardly an either-or proposition when two such parties are drinking deeply from the same rich Ignatian well, replete with the influence of Arrupe, whom both Francis and Sosa frequently cite and so evidently admire. If I were to add a final word, a word that Francis would surely approve, that word would be relax. Relax. What is it? Descansa? Just as Jesus came proclaiming that his yoke is easy and his burden light, Matthew 11:30, we who aspire to follow the path pioneered by the likes of Ignatius and Pedro Arrupe should not feel pressured to do it all, that is, to exceed the natural limits of our physical and mental energies. One key theme of Ignatian spirituality is self-knowledge, and knowing that we are not God is a wonderful grace, if you're open to receiving it and fighting our built-in Pelagianism, right? If you are already a busy person, as we all seem to be in this frenetic digital age, the proper goal is to focus your energies, to establish strong spiritual priorities. We should all aspire to become truly contemplatives in action, people with Christ at our center, Christocentric, not egocentric. Rather than simply doing more things, employ prudence so as to do a few of the most important things more deliberately and more reflectively in light of God's calling. That's why I love the fact that the four apostolic preferences just mentioned come with a reminder that they should not function as a checklist or an action plan consisting of additional things to be done by busy Jesuits or busy anybody for that matter. The four preferences provide, rather, a path to spiritual renewal and potentially greater social justice orientation. There's a parallel here to what Arrupe accomplished in challenging Jesuit schools to emphasize more deeply than ever before education for justice. The reforms called for did not consist of adding new material to overcrowded curricula, but rather it constituted a challenge to highlight the justice dimension that has come to infuse all of our schools as allies in the struggle for justice. I join Arrupe and Francis and Ignatius, for that matter, in contending that you can undergo substantial reorientation in a way that will not drive you crazy, but rather in a way that brings you closer to God in a spiritual style that is relaxed and effective at the same time. Our aspiration for justice must never be completely fulfilled in this life. It won't be. But we surely do find inspiration in our forebears, Ignatius, Arrupe, Francis. Final paragraph. I hope that the braiding of these four elements, Ignatius, Vatican II, Arrupe, and Pope Francis, has shed some light not merely on each one of them individually, but also on their interrelation. Each gains much currency from its juxtaposition with the others, and we all benefit from how they have worked together to inspire social justice efforts under the banner of the cross in our troubled times. Thank you very much.
The questions are coming, and Father is waiting for your comments or your questions. You have the paper, you have to write the questions, and we're waiting for you.
Okay, so write some easy questions.